You mentioned earlier sadness, and you mentioned during your reading that the Finkler Question is a novel of mourning. Did those more somber, let's say, twilight or later life themes surprise you as they emerge? Because the book, in a sense, starts off fairly rollicking comedy, posing the questions you ask about Jewish identity, the Jewish experience. And then I felt, anyways, it kind of growing in resonance almost, the implications as it moved along. Was that something that was surprising you as you were writing, or were you planning that?
I knew I was writing a book about, although I didn't know much about where I was going, I knew I wanted to write about sorrow. And I knew I wanted to write about mourning. In fact, the novel is dedicated to three friends who died. You know, you would think, if you don't look at the dates, that the novel is so steeped in grief for those one loves, that you might have thought that these friends, it was the death of these three friends three friends my age within a month of one another, that was the inspiration for the book. But that happened late in the book, almost as a confirmation of the book. It was terrible, really, as I was finishing the book, and suddenly, instead of the book...
You started off with the plot with three friends, and then in the course of writing it, you lost three friends.
Yes.
That's extraordinary.
And you know, I've not even put the three, until you just said that there, I'd not put the three to myself. I'd not put it to myself like that. I just thought friends had died, but I was writing about friends. Yes. But then as one gets to this age, I don't need to, tell people of my age, loss starts to become part of one's life. And that was one of the reasons I felt I have to address this. I have to address it through dread, because it's my great dread. I'm not a person I don't have religious conviction, though I would never for a moment call myself an atheist. I'm an entirely irreligious non-atheist. I hate all these books about atheism that you can't. And when I see fellow writers embracing the atheists and reading Dawkins and saying, "Isn't it great?" I feel so ashamed of them, because, except I don't want to use the word ashamed. It's too loaded in this novel. So I take that back. I'm not ashamed. But I do feel that they let down the business of being a writer and an artist, which is about non-certitude. We don't have certitude, and atheists offer certitude. And a writer can't have certitude. I can't know anything if I'm a novelist. You should not want to read me if I offer myself as knowing something. So if you read on the front jacket of a book that the novelist is an atheist, don't read him. I hope you don't have a jacket that's got an atheist, saying you're an atheist on the front. He might be somewhere in his secret heart, but he mustn't want to announce it as a piece of knowledge.
Just for the sake of argument, what about the existentialism of the Hemingway generation, Camus, for whom the non-presence of God was a starting point to moral clarity and exploration? Do you consider that?
Well, they were necessary at that hour. Things are. You combat your time. Right. I can see that. But there's no reason to... I suppose there's an argument for combating art faced with religious fundamentalisms from all the great faiths. I can see why there is an argument to be made against religion. But not amongst intellect, not between ourselves, as it were. Between ourselves, we are all unbelievers. Therefore, the great argument is going to be the argument for belief, not against it, if there has to be any argument at all. But anyway, look, I got to that simply by talking about mourning, and I was wanting to talk about dread. And because I have no religious conviction, I dread it. We all dread death, but I particularly dread it. I'm not saying, my death is going to be more terrible than yours, but it will. But at the moment, sitting here, it feels more terrible than yours is going to be. And I actually dread... It's partly I don't particularly want to talk a lot about Jewish things, because I seem to have been doing nothing else, and it's the price you pay for writing a novel that has a lot of Jewish people in it. But there is a Jewish penalty. There is something about Jewish death that's always worried me, because there's some finality about it that I can't bear. The fact that when a Jew dies, they're buried almost immediately. They're out of luck, gone. And it's true that the Jews are people of memory, and it's necessary to go on remembering. And fond sons and daughters go on remembering in prayer for years afterwards, but that's still the living remembering. The dead are just gone. You go to a Jewish cemetery and it's utterly depressing. It's stone and it's cold, and we won't have beautiful memorials. And I would like something with, my wife and I talk about these things because I have made her morbid. And, would you like an angel, darling? And she said, an angel would be nice, and I think a chariot would be nice. And you kind of not meant to have this. You must meant to have this slab, and there are such cold places. And there's a part of me, whenever I see a country churchyard in England, I pause, and I'm a lover of Gray's Elegy, and I suddenly become entirely an Englishman at that moment and want to lie in some country churchyard. Why do I want to lie in a churchyard? But I do. And because too, here is something we could talk about, because to be Jewish is partly to have intellectually rejected nature. The Jewish God is a non-nature God, he's a non-mythological figure. He invents God, he invents the world as an act of the intellect. A world would be a nice place. Let there be light. Let there be light. It's almost got nothing to do with light itself. It's by the will. So we are as a concept, entirely in our being, we are a people who reject nature. Therefore, the idea of returning to nature that some people have in death. In death, we return to nature. I wish I could feel that's nice. I wish I could feel it would be lovely to be part of the soil. I travelled a lot in Australia, just a fluke of my life, and I remember falling in love with a graveyard near a cemetery near a vineyard, and there were lots of people who'd grown wine buried there, and they all had a little inscription saying, that my body will disappear into the soil and will help the wine grow. I'm a lover of wine. I'd love the idea that out of me was to come, an infinitude of red wine. Wouldn't that be fantastic? And yet I can't quite believe in that.
Lots of people have converted to Christianity for the booze.
I'm prepared to do it. I'm prepared to do it for the
Italian
booze.
Catholicism might do you fine then. You could.
Can I convert and still keep all the Jewish parts that I like? Can I pick and choose? I'll have a little bit of this and a little bit of that.
Well, funny you should mention that, because obviously your character, Justin Treslov,
yes,
has a go at that.
Yes.
How'd that work out for him?
Not very well.
No.
Treslov wants to be Jewish. The third member, the one who I told you, is not widowed because he hasn't got anybody to be widowed by, but envies the two men who are widows. The two widowers are also Jewish, and he is not, and he fancies the idea of being Jewish. In fact, something happens to him that persuades him he probably is Jewish. He has no evidence for this, but the very absence of evidence is the very proof, he thinks. When they say, Julian Treslov is not a Jewish name, he says, precisely. And when they say, did your parents ever talk to you about Judaism? He said, no, not a word. And what does that mean?
Hush, hush, the whole thing. Yes. Male friendship is fundamental to the Finkler question. Once again, was this a theme you resolved to explore, or did it come out of the characters?
I think I've always written about male friendship. I think my first novel, which was called Coming From Behind, and it was a kind of campus novel, but it was an anti-campus novel about an institution that was so appalling it didn't even have a campus. And that was a novel about friendships, and it was about how all the men in that are in an envious race with one another. One gets a credit card and the other one says, well, what's your credit limit? And he then has to try and get a credit card with a greater credit limit. I think the envy that men feel for one another is a kind of taboo, and you're not meant to admit it. And I've always enjoyed writing about that male friendship is full of envy and rivalry, and there's a lot of envy and rivalry in this. And in fact, the reason that I wrote that novel was that my best friend at school, and we were in a race as to who was going to be the more successful in literature in one way or another, had just produced a book. And I couldn't live with the fact that he'd got a book out before I'd got a book. I could not exist with that. So it had an extraordinary galvanizing effect on me. I then made this novel. And, you know, I've never told anybody this before because it's never occurred to me. It's the way you put the question. But I now realise that the germinating force of this novel, what was your creative force? Envy.
That's a classic, I think, isn't it? Motivator, along with those other things we were discussing earlier.
They're not. This is not going to be YouTubed, is it? I'm not going to be on the YouTube having to say. Howard Jacobson said, "Oh, there's a camera there." I don't mean it. That was a joke.
You could pull back and discuss not necessarily envy of your friend's success, but a lot of books I've often suspected are written out of a kind of envy or yearning for a greater book of a similar kind, and you want to try and write that book. It's not as personal, but it's maybe how books get produced often, because they come. You've read other books. You've spoken, for instance, about Tristram Shandy and your love of that novel.
No, I don't like that novel.
You don't like Dr. Shandy? Misunderstood you? Okay.
No. See how easy things can go wrong. No. I mean, I think Tristram Shandy, a lot of people see Tristram Shandy as sort of the beginning of a particular tradition of comedy in the English novel. I don't like that one. I think that's the beginning of a tradition of just footling about, jesting. You know, the kind of, well, I know Canada has and Britain has would-be magic realist novels when we try to be South Americans. And we can't do it. And we absolutely can't do it. You know, the magic is false, and we can't do the digressions properly. And most of the writers who try this cite Tristram Shandy as their. I'm not going to name the names of these novelists. We could have another queue afterwards, you know, which I talk to you about who the novelists are that I'm thinking of. But I think that for me is a dead end. I see something wonderful happening in the 18th century in England when the novel is being born, and some people think the novel is being born out of Tristram Shandy, and I think the novel is born out of Dr. Johnson, that little book Rasselas, which if you don't know, you should know, which is one of the great. It's a moral tale, and it doesn't really look like a novel at first, and then it just opens out and is wonderfully a novel. And out of Rasselas comes Jane Austen. Jane Austen doesn't come out of Tristram Shandy.
No, indeed not.
She comes out of Dr. Johnson. And as you've said, I am the Jewish Jane Austen.
Yes, you are.
I surprise people when I mean that.
You do mean that, do you?
You mean that? Yes, I do.
That's the tradition you feel you're.
Yes, it was the tradition I was schooled in as a student, and it's been, it goes, I can trace the tradition for, it goes Jane Austen, it goes through the Brontes a little bit. In Jane Eyre, you might remember that in Jane Eyre, when Jane Eyre goes off to boarding school when she's small, or it's worse than boarding school, whatever it is, and she meets somebody called Helen Burns. I think it's Helen Burns. And I stole that name as a character in my first novel as my homage to this. And Helen Burns knows Rasselas off by heart. There was a time when people knew a work like Rasselas off by heart. And then George Eliot comes along, and she has that tradition behind her. Dickens, slightly less so, but it's still there in Dickens. And then you get what I think is the great moralizing tradition of the English novel. But at the same time, it's aware of the limitations of moralizing. But I actually am a moralizing writer. In fact, I just hide it well.
Is satire, would you consider yourself a satiric writer?
Sometimes.
Okay.
Sometimes. There is satire in Finkler. There are a group of people in Finkler called the Ashamed Jews. And these are Jews who just go about announcing to the world how ashamed they are of being Jewish. Partly because, well, for all sorts of reasons. I mean, some of them genuinely feel ashamed of being Jewish because of Israel and other reasons. Some of them just want to curry favor with the non-Jewish world. There have always been Jews who want to curry favor with the non-Jewish world. There have always been Jews who want not to be Jewish. That was part of what I wanted to write about here, comedically. It strikes me as funny, but it's some kind of fact about the Jewish religion that's interesting. This is interesting whether you're Jewish or not, I think. And my theory is it's monotheism. That when you invent monotheism and you have the idea of one God, you make it very, very difficult for people to know where to go if they don't feel very sympathetic to that one God. If you're a pagan, it's fantastic, There's the God of water, there's the God of this table, there's the God of this book. You pray to the God of water, it doesn't give you what you want. I now believe in the God of the table. It's fantastic, and you can still remain within your society. But if the God who says, I am the only God and there should be no other God before me, if that God lets you down, or for whatever reason you don't like the way he talks to you or something, what do? So you have to jump ship. So Jews have been jumping ship almost from the word go. It's what Jews do. It's a wonderful thing about Jewish culture. I once said Jewish religion, about Jewish culture, that there is always this divergence of opinion. I mean, it's a joke made that whenever two Jews are in the same room, they will argue fiercely about everything, but particularly about what it is to be a Jew. And it all goes back, I think, to that one God. But anyway, for whatever reason, there is this group of Jews in this novel who are called the ashamed Jews. They also comprise there's a certain kind of Jew that we're seeing a lot now in Britain. I don't know if you have them here. They're personalities, often television personalities, who didn't know they were Jewish. And then they go on some television program that traces their genealogy. Have those, who were you, or who do you think you are, or I didn't know what my name is. And they always end up in Auschwitz. The last scene is they're always in Auschwitz, and they're always with tears running down. Never knew that this happened to my great-great-grandfather. And that's how the program ends, with them sobbing in Auschwitz. Everybody wants to have been to Auschwitz. Explain that. And then there's an article about them will appear. This program will go out on a Monday night. And then on Tuesday and Wednesdays, there will be interviews with them in which they say how wonderful it is to be Jewish. I think it's marvelous to be Jewish. I'm so proud. I always knew, really, somewhere, that there was something about me that could only be explained by the fact that I'm Jewish, and now I understand. And that's that. And they're Jewish, and they start wearing Stars of David around their neck, and they've got the skull cap on by Friday. And then that Saturday, you see them in Trafalgar Square in a demonstration against Israel, holding a placard saying, "We are all Hezbollah." So this group, comprising these various people, gather together. They call themselves the Ashamed Jews, and they meet in a club in London called the Groucho Club, which is a nice place where intellectuals meet in the middle of London. And they get together and they kvetch about Israel. And that's satire. I mean, that's, it's quite broad satire.
It occurred to me, reading the Finkler Question, that generally a quality of your prose that I find extraordinary is, and someone called this your unsimplifying intelligence, that your sentences almost detonate each other. They seem to undermine each other, the positions held by the characters, or the characters immediately undermine their own positions. If not canceling each other out, then at least just throwing things, refusing to simplify, asking questions more than answering them. I wondered if the Ashamed Jews, though, and you mentioned it as an example of a satiric intention, is a little bit more of you coming forward in the book, stepping out and saying, this I do not agree with.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And
is there any particular reason you've done that now, or is that, I've read half a dozen of your books, but...
There was a lot in the original, in an earlier draft of this, there were a lot more of the Ashamed Jews. And I decided this was satire, was too farcical, actually, and was not in the mode that I prefer to write. And I think this is, the comedy of the Ashamed Jews is fairly simple. Mm-hmm. And that's because you're quite right to single it out. And that's because I wrote it in a rage. And I describe, as I talk to you now about them, I am in a rage. And I wanted to control this as best I could in the course of this novel. I thought very much about taking it out, because I am a writer that believes the writer must not be there. Right. What I think, particularly politically, must not be there. But I wanted a bit of it to be there, because at the time I was writing it, the novel started to change in the way that we were talking about. And the novel I started this novel before Israel's incursion into Gaza in, 2 years ago or something. And then I'm writing it about these friends and about one of them wanting to be Jewish at the same time as that's happening. And I don't know what it was like here. Well, I do know a little bit about what it was like here occasionally because I did one or two interviews for Canadian radio about this and that. And things were being said about Israel, and by extension, I believe, though this is, to be argued about, is argued about in the book, and by extension being said about Jews, which made me so angry that I was writing many, many articles about it outside of my novelist persona, and couldn't keep it out of the novel.
Okay.
Just couldn't keep it out. And whether that was a proper aesthetic decision, I don't know. It might have been the wrong aesthetic decision to keep it in. But it's not done the book any harm, it would seem.